travelled some distance, and a particular welcome to our friends from Atlantic Baptist University to the north. Just one or two quick announcements before I introduce our speaker this evening. The first is that we have several books which will be on the table at the rear, just outside of the back doors, for sale later on. They've derived their being from a series which we've put together here from a series of lectures, the Acadia series. Some of the lectures are from our own professors and some are from distinguished visitors, such as Bishop Wright. There will be a DVD and a CD-ROM and audio tapes available of this lecture series once it's been completed. And as soon as they're formatted and prepared, we'll advertise them on our website. So I suspect it'll take a month or so before we actually get them produced, but you're very welcome to contact us, and we'll provide you with any materials, media materials that you'd like to buy. So, this evening, we're very pleased indeed to have our distinguished guest, the Right Reverend Tom Wright, Lord Bishop of Durham, here this evening. He's asked me to be brief and just mention a few things about him. I was given his CV, which was extremely long. He's been the author of some 50-plus books, a prolific writer, somebody who is, whilst orthodox, does indeed always produce very thought-provoking comments and writings, and it's been certainly a very interactive time last night, and I'm sure this evening will be equally so. He has 4 children, 2 boys, 2 girls, and 2 grandchildren. It's rather biblical, coming 2 by 2. And I did notice on his CV his age. Suffice to say, I shan't mention his birthday, but his wisdom exceeds his years. Bishop Wright, we're very pleased to have you this evening. A warm welcome to you and, of course, to your wife. And we're delighted to hear you give us this lecture this evening. Thank you.
Thank you very much. That's good. Thank you. Thank you again, and it's good to be back here. And grateful to those who are prepared to sit so nobly out in the front like this. And there are 1 or 2 spare seats. I think I see some people still coming in, so they can perhaps find slots in here. I have to say, I'm going to be talking, as you probably know, about aesthetics, the arts, and all that this evening. And to come in and hear a wonderful impromptu concert going on upstairs, and then to come downstairs and think about aesthetic theory is like walking down a high street and reading all the menus in front of the restaurants, but not actually going in to have any of the food. So I hope it won't be quite as bad as that. And if any of you really want some genuine artistic experience, if that young lady is still singing upstairs, feel free to pop out and hear another song and then come back. So anyway. The question I'm raising this evening can be posed in terms of 2 lines from the book of the prophet Isaiah. In chapter 6, as part of the story of the prophet's call, he relates how he heard the seraphim singing, "Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh, God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory." Chapter 6, verse 3. We might have expected the seraphim to say, in line with Psalm 19, verse 1, that the whole heavens were full of the glory of God. To say this of the earth is far more remarkable. The prophet at once responds that he at least is not full of glory. He's a man of unclean lips and he dwells among a people of unclean lips. Something very odd is going on here. The claim seems to operate at a different level entirely. There is a tension between what the seraphim are celebrating, that the whole earth is full of Yahweh's glory, and what Isaiah senses to be true. But then 5 chapters later, chapter 11, we find a similar claim, not this time about the present, but about the future, in which, under the rule of the peaceful and justice-bringing king, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of Yahweh, as the waters cover the sea. Chapter 11, verse 9. The earth shall be full of the knowledge of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. Now, of course, knowledge and glory are not the same, even when we bring in Habakkuk 2:14 to bridge the gap, because there we have the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the glory of Yahweh as the waters cover the sea. And you can't simply smooth out that tension in terms of saying, as some have, of course, that chapter 11 was probably written by somebody different to chapter 6. You might have expected the redactor to smooth out an obvious exegetical puzzle. But you find the same future hope expressed in a similar context to that of Isaiah 11 in the royal hymn that we know as Psalm 72. Blessed be his glorious name forever. May his glory fill the whole earth. And then this little list of passages comes full circle when we trace the idea of something being filled with Yahweh's glory to several references in the Old Testament to the glory of Yahweh filling, of course, the tabernacle or the temple. Which brings us back to where we started, because, of course, that's what was going on in chapter 6 of Isaiah. The glory of Yahweh had filled the house, and the seraphim are singing, actually, his glory is filling the whole earth. So Isaiah and the Psalms seem to be looking forward to Yahweh doing with the whole of creation what he sometimes does with the temple, that is, to fill it with his glory. But what the seraphim are claiming in Isaiah 6, precisely when the temple is being filled with Yahweh's glory, is that the whole earth is already, in some sense, a shrine, a temple, a vessel filled with Yahweh's glory. It isn't so much that, well, there's heaven and then there's earth, and they happen to be full of Yahweh's glory. It is truly exciting to say that the earth is full of Yahweh's glory, a glory which we assume properly belongs in heaven itself. One or two people still standing. Please do find seats if you want. I would be embarrassed if you're standing when there are seats, so please do that. The apparent tension, then, between Isaiah chapter 6, verse 3 and Isaiah chapter 11, verse 9, thus elaborated, is sharpened further when we consider the relation between the two lines of the Song of the Seraphim. Holy, holy, holy is Yahweh God of hosts. The whole earth is full of his glory. If Yahweh's glory does indeed fill the whole earth, this is the glory of the one who is superlatively holy. Glory is not then something totally other than holiness. The glory with which not just heaven but the whole earth is filled is the glory of the utterly holy God, which makes the reaction of the prophet more predictable, but also more intense and paradoxical to the point of seeming almost contradictory. Humans, it seems, including the people of Israel, are radically out of joint, not just with Yahweh himself, but also with his whole creation, the world which is, strangely, somehow, filled with the glory of the utterly Holy One. So it isn't the case that God's glory is visible and available irrespective of the holiness or otherwise of human beings. And this in turn makes the promise of Isaiah 11 all the more striking. The promise of a world in which justice happens at last, in which peace flourishes, in which the out-of-jointness has been put right, and in which knowledge of Yahweh will flood the earth as the waters fill the basin of the sea at the fullest high tide. I wrote that last sentence before I knew that you have the fullest of high tides right here in this town. I wish Isaiah had known that too. I don't think he'd heard of Nova Scotia, sadly. The tension between Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 11 sets the stage for the later developments in the book of Isaiah, including the story of new creation in chapters 40 to 55 and the visions of new heavens and new earth in chapters 65 and 66. And somehow the vision of an entire creation made over anew is fused with the vision of the restored and peaceful Jerusalem, as though at last the filling of the temple with the glory of God and the filling of creation with the glory of God become effectively two different ways of saying more or less the same thing. I now want to use this tension between Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 11 as the framework for my main thesis this evening, which is about aesthetics. How do we come to terms with a world full of beauty in which we, like the prophet, are also aware of great ugliness? Or, to put it the other way, a world full of ugliness and violence in which we are constantly reminded of beauty and peace. One of my colleagues, when I worked at Westminster Abbey, used to say that one can talk about the problem of evil, if you like, but that sort of assumes, if you put it like that we actually know there is a lot of good out there, and you might just as well talk about the problem of good. Why is there so much that is good and beautiful and lovely if the world is in fact random and chaotic and stupid? My proposal is that fresh readings of the Bible are available which can give fresh impetus to Christian imagination, and that a consideration of the biblical cosmology in particular, about which I spoke yesterday, and which the two passages in Isaiah invite us to contemplate in more detail, can provide a framework for a fresh Christian understanding of beauty in general and art in particular, and can point us, as I argued yesterday, a fresh understanding of apocalyptic can point us through the questions and puzzles of postmodernity and out the other side into a freshly creative and culturally fruitful worldview. So this lecture thus aims to advance yesterday's argument from one angle in particular, that of imagination and aesthetics, and so to prepare the way for the third and final lecture tomorrow night, when the worldview questions that I'm considering must be brought to bear upon today's disturbing political realities. The main point I want to make is that the Bible, read as a whole, not least in narrative mode, enables us to understand, to reappropriate, and to celebrate the role of the imagination as part of a redeemed and renewed, image-bearing human life. For much of the last generation or two, perhaps longer, within Western Christianity, the churches have had trouble in understanding, let alone celebrating, the role of the imagination and hence of the arts. Often the arts have been brought in to provide, as it were, the pretty bits around the edge. Music and literature and dance and painting and the rest have been allowed on stage somewhat after the manner of the supporting acts that warm up the audience before the principal performer eventually arrives. The arts are not the main event. Nor is this attitude confined to the churches. Don't know about in Canada these days, but in England right now, in schools and in society at large, the artist and the musician often occupy a strange liminal position, as though educationalists know in their bones that they ought to value that sort of stuff, but can't quite work out why, let alone justify it to the bean counters when budgets are tight. And sometimes in church as in school, the arts are seen simply as ways of people letting off steam, non-energetic indoor sports, in effect, so that one may thereby be refreshed for the real business, which is somewhere else. But in fact, the arts can and should refresh in a far deeper way than that, and can and should contribute to the rejuvenation of everything else as well. I go further and propose that, without the dimension that the arts contribute, other human endeavours, from the teaching of mathematics to the practice of prayer, are diminished and hindered. I now want to develop this proposal within the framework of cosmology and time and matter, which I outlined yesterday, and suggest that art can properly have a role within the refreshed apocalyptic of which I spoke, that sense of the curtain being drawn back, so that heaven is visible from earth, the past and the future can be glimpsed from within the present, and the deeper significance of the material universe, both as it is and as it may be, can be known with a knowledge that is different from, yet not entirely different from, that of our ordinary experience. In a book published earlier this year called Simply Christian, which some of you may have seen, I suggested as an introduction to a chapter on beauty that beauty, whether natural beauty or the beauty glimpsed in the arts, could be at least partially understood on the analogy of an incomplete musical score. I invented a little fable about people discovering a musical manuscript in an attic in Vienna or somewhere and playing it through and discovering this really is by Mozart, but then it seems to be incomplete, and discerning that if it's the piano part, it's the piano part for a larger piece of work which is now lost. We don't know whether it's a string quartet or maybe it's a violin sonata or something. We've got something which is both beautiful in itself but hauntingly points beyond itself to a completion which at the moment we don't have. The part points to a greater beauty of which it is designed to be one element, complemented and enhanced and fulfilled by others of which at the moment we remain ignorant. So transpose that image onto the beauty of the world as we know it. The world is indeed charged with the grandeur of God, but generations have trod, and all is seared with trade, bleared, smeared with toil. I'm quoting Hopkins, as some of you will realize. And wears man's smudge and shares man's smell. And for all this, nature is never spent. There is something new, something still to come, which will complete the beauty, which will get us, if you like, from Isaiah 6, the world is already charged with the grandeur of God, to Isaiah 11, the earth shall be full of the knowledge of the Lord as the waters cover the sea. But at this point, the aesthetic traditions inherited by our contemporary culture have gone in different ways. At the risk of gross oversimplification, I highlight only two trends in our fast-moving and confusing world. And I know perfectly well that if I were to take time out sideways from my day job and spend lots of hours in art galleries and so on, it would be rather fun to write several lectures about this and explore all sorts of different traditions. But I'm only just going to name two things. On the one hand, we have sentimentalism, the attempt to affirm the glory of the world while denying or ignoring the smudge and the smell. To get, if you like, the seraph's song without Isaiah's proper reaction. So we just think, oh yes, isn't that lovely? It's glorious. And screening out the woe is me, I am undone, and all the rest of it. If you do that in real life, you produce a sickly smile, sadly all too recognizable within some Christian circles. Do it in art, and you produce the kind of art and music found, alas, in quite a few churches as well. If you want to find kitsch, the churches aren't the only place to look, but it's not a bad place to start. On the other hand, we have brutalism, which, like postmodernism itself, began as a style of architecture associated, in this case, with raw concrete, béton brut in French, turned with deliberate punning intent into the abstract noun brutalism. But brutalism has spread further and wider than simply the concrete monstrosities that have littered our cities since the 1950s and 1960s. I was speaking about this in a lecture in Harvard last month and was taken to task by somebody who took me outside the building where I was and pointed out one of his favorite buildings, which is a classic brutalist building just immediately to the east of the main campus. So I was properly called on it. I didn't like it, but there we were. But brutalism can be seen just as much, I suggest, not simply in those concrete buildings, but in the kind of art which draws attention to stark, supposedly realist images. In my country, Tracy Emin's unmade bed, or somebody or other's dead cow pickled in formaldehyde, or tin cans full of excrement. And they get government grants to do this stuff. As with the concrete box, that wouldn't happen in Canada, would it? No. As with the concrete boxes, these are ways of declaring what Isaiah said without the seraph's song. Woe is me, life is nasty, it's stark and harsh and raw and unpretty and in your face. Don't try, says brutalism, to con us into thinking that there's anything actually good going on. This world is nasty and messy, and let's just wallow in it and rub each other's faces in it. And faced with this, and obviously this is an oversimplification, sentimentalism and brutalism, there are many other degrees in between and many other movements going in different directions, I know that. But I hope it's at least a recognizable statement of one tension within our present cultural landscape. I've got three proposals. First, I want to suggest that the apocalyptic framework and worldview I outlined yesterday offers a way of understanding why beauty is what it is, why art is what it is, which could, in principle, engage with, in dialogue with the various classic proposals within traditional accounts of aesthetics. I'm not going to go through all the business of so-and-so says this and this is my comment and all of that. That'd be fun, but not for tonight. Then the second thing I shall propose is that art can generate a hermeneutic space within which the Christian faith can be reimagined within and for today's and tomorrow's culture. In other words, not just the pretty bit round the edge, actually a way forward in saying what we believe and saying it in a way that the world might hear. And third, I want to suggest that within this framework, the scriptural traditions can offer us resources for finding a way forwards without that collapse, which is so easy, into either sentimentalism or brutalism. So, first, where shall beauty be found? The question of beauty, what it is and why, and the question of art, in what way it reflects and embodies the beauty of the world, goes back, like most philosophical questions in the Western world, to Plato, though without, in this case, a strong tradition of discussion all the way through until more or less the last 2 or 3 centuries. And you may be glad to know that even if I were competent to review this history, there wouldn't be time to do so now. I simply want to pick up the debate where some recent works have left off. I have in mind John Carey's interesting little book, What Are the Arts? Carey writing as rather a cynical, atheistic commentator, and then from a totally different point of view, Rowan Williams's book, Grace and Necessity, dealing with the aesthetic theory that emerges from the French theologian Jacques Maritain. And I'm not going to discuss them, but they're some of the markers for where I think the debate has been, in my culture at least. And I want to parachute in with some fresh ideas, which I hope may stimulate some of you, perhaps, to explore the interdisciplinary questions that I raise in the proper depth. And if I start some hairs running and start some people in this room thinking, wow, that's actually something I want to follow up, then I shall be well pleased. Beauty, I suggest, is one of the points at which, in the sense of yesterday's lecture, apocalypse happens. Beauty of whatever sort offers a glimpse of the overlap of heaven and earth, the chiming of past and future with the present, and the transfiguring of the physical material world. And I believe that our culture is actually open to this possibility today in new ways, not least through the effect of the postmodern turn on the previously prevailing secularism. We are rapidly leaving behind the stale denials of late modernity, in which everything was reduced to functionalism and spirituality was just an escapist luxury. Most people now recognize that human life is multidimensional, and that what we can touch and see, what we can weigh on the scales or calculate in a bank balance, is only one dimension of a much richer existence, of a universe full of meaning, which some find positively threatening and disorienting, and others see as a glimpse of glory. That's not to say, of course, that we can simply go back to a pre-modern worldview. We can't, and that's part of the excitement. We can and must go forward through the decay of secularism, and indeed through the negative aspects of postmodernity. Think about the effect of postmodernity on ordinary aesthetic awareness. The great stories of beauty would find themselves first deconstructed into being merely functions in the eye of the beholder, and then they would disappear entirely as the beholder too would cease to exist as a safe, secure repository for any ideas. As I said last night, the ego collapses under the weight of that deconstruction. No, we must go through the negativity of postmodernity and out the other side to embrace something new, something deeply and truly in line with biblical and apocalyptic worldviews, something for which there isn't actually yet a name except the rather arm-waving one of postmodernity. And as I said yesterday, nobody appears to be leading the way, certainly where I'm looking in the cultural world, leading the way towards any renaissance any more than they are in the political sphere right now. The politicians continue with their late modern rhetoric, vote for me and we will bring in some sort of modernist utopia, while the voters shrug their postmodern shoulders and stay away from the polls in droves. And art then declines, as I said, into sentimental kitsch on the one hand, or sterile brutalism on the other. And sometimes it seems that the only way that music can escape a similar fate, trivial jingles on the one hand and serial cacophony on the other, is through ever more difficult and intellectually and emotionally challenging work, which then runs all the risks of highbrow snobbery. But from the Christian point of view, the cultural impasse that we're in at the turn of the millennia ought to open up a new possibility, a possibility of re-expressing once more the truth that heaven and earth really are the interlocking spheres of God's good creation, and that in the arts, not least in music, we are constantly brought within the sight and the sound of that other reality. As Francis Thompson puts it in a famous poem, the angels keep their ancient places, turn but a stone and start a wing. 'Tis ye, 'tis your estranged faces that miss the many-splendid thing. The early Christian vision of worship, expressed classically in Revelation 4 and 5, picks up the song of the seraphim from Isaiah 6 and develops it. And the point about the glimpse into the heavenly throne room in Revelation 4 and 5 is not that this is what heaven is like in total contradistinction to earth. Rather, this is the heavenly dimension of the worship which is offered to the Creator on earth by the whole cosmos. And learning to see that when you look at creatures in the world gloriously being themselves, you can glimpse, like in Francis Thompson's poem, the angels in their proper places. You can see the beasts falling on their faces and the elders casting their crowns before the throne and so on. Then you're starting to get the true picture. The animals and the human beings praise God in Revelation 4 precisely as Creator, the maker of all things, the one worthy of praise in and through all things. They don't quote the key line from the original Isaianic song, "The whole earth is full of His glory," but they express and they embody that line in what they're doing. Now, this is not to say, just in case any of you were worried at this point, having been told that I was an Orthodox theologian, it's always a risky thing to say that when you're introducing a speaker. This is not to say that every glimpse of beauty, let alone every work of art, is a vision of heaven, or indeed vice versa. It's only to suggest that art is what it is because it is responding to and providing in turn fresh examples of that multidimensionality of the created order for which the Jewish and Christian traditions offer a particular analysis. I have in mind here, especially, that most visionary of letters, Ephesians, about which I spoke this morning, where the opening prayer, chapter 1, verses 3 to 14, one great long sentence of celebration, that opening prayer celebrates the fact that the Creator has willed to draw all things together, things in heaven and things on earth, in Jesus Christ. And this, he says, is God's aim and plan according to His purpose and good pleasure. That coming together of heaven and earth and of all things within them in Jesus Christ is something that gives the Creator Himself, in other words, deep and rich pleasure. We don't often think, in the Western Protestant traditions at least, of God being deeply pleased and happy about something. But my proposal is that beauty is what we glimpse when we humans are allowed to catch sight, even if, like Moses, it may be from behind, of the Creator taking delight in the fulfillment of His purposes in creation itself. You may be familiar with Karl Barth's famous bon mot about the angels playing Bach for God, but playing Mozart for themselves, and God eavesdropping on the Mozart. If I'm right, we should, if anything, imagine that picture the other way around. Why should God be the more severe? Not that Bach is actually more severe, but that's the implication of the story. Bach's rather sort of grand and ecclesiastical, and Mozart's is not actually like that, and Bach knew it wasn't like that. But why should it be that way round? According to Paul, God the Creator takes supreme and absolute delight, glorious happiness, in the drawing together of heaven and earth. And we human beings catch the echo of it, enough to sweep us off our feet with echoing delight. And from Ephesians we might go forward to the truly visionary ending to the New Testament, the vision of the heavenly city, described with lavish attention to its cubic architectural perfection, its multi-jeweled gates, and its clear as glass golden streets. The word beauty, I don't think, occurs in Revelation 21, because as writers among you will know, when you want to say as a writer, that's really beautiful, you don't tell the reader, this is really beautiful. You describe it in such a way that the reader experiences beauty. That's what's going on in that passage. And note once again that this New Jerusalem is coming down from heaven to earth. The beauty, the divine delight in which we humans are invited to share, lies at the point where heaven and earth are made for one another, and where they come together in that meeting for which John the seer employs the image taken itself from Genesis 1 and 2 of marriage. Beauty, then, I suggest, can partly at least be understood in terms of the overlap of heaven and earth. And in addition, the same Jewish and Christian traditions offer a paradigm for understanding something about art which goes beyond mere multidimensionality. It's pretty important, but goes beyond that and into the world of narrative, of story. In other words, not only of heaven and earth as different dimensions, but of past and present and future. By itself, multidimensionality might simply take us back to Plato. Plato saw art, human artifacts of art, as a two removes from the genuinely beautiful. The world of the forms, for him, is the truly beautiful. Our world of space and time and matter is a mere reflection or copy of the forms, and then human art is a mere reflection of the world of space, time and matter, rather as though the moon had a moon, if you see what I mean, kind of a double reflection. Rather, the Jewish tradition in that sequence of thought in Isaiah and the Christian tradition in the sequence that runs from the glimpse of heaven in Revelation 4 and 5 through to the creation of new heavens and new earth, the earth which is already full of Yahweh's glory, offers a larger narrative within which the present creation, full of glory, functions as a signpost towards the new creation that has been promised, and which, according to the New Testament, has arrived in Jesus Christ, and especially in his resurrection. The glimpses of glory are not simply, then, glimpses of an upstairs world of which the downstairs world reminds us, but perhaps more importantly, glimpses of a future world for which the present one was made. Think of Browning, the last of life for which the first was made, and towards which it continues to strain, and at the same time also a memory of those past acts of God in which, as at the Exodus or the events concerning Jesus, that same glory was revealed. To see this worked out, you might go, for instance, to John's extraordinary resurrection narrative, where with matchless artistry John has described the resurrection of Jesus precisely as the first day of the new week. I've written about this at length in various places. On the first day of the week. What is John saying? This is the 8th day. It's the beginning of new creation. And in case you miss the point, he rubs it in verse 19, the evening of that day, the first day of the week. You know, John, like Shakespeare at this point, does nothing by accident. This is very carefully crafted. This is the prototypical, paradigmatic, defining moment of new creation. Is it any wonder you get those wonderful works of art that have tuned in to the meeting between Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the Noli Me Tangere moment, and where you feel in the paintings that sense, this is the beginning. This is not the end of the story. This is the beginning of the real story, the beginning of new creation. And within that new creation, this is the point of resurrection, there is the reaffirmation of the old. That which was hinted at earlier in the gospel has come to fruition and must now go out into the world in new projects, new witness to the glory of God revealed in Jesus. But perhaps the most decisive passage is again the climax of Romans 8:18 through 27, where Paul speaks of the present creation groaning in travail, enslaved to decay and futility. Like Isaiah, we are undone. This world is a mess. This is not a happy place to be. But like the children of Israel in Egypt, the creation is longing for exodus, for liberation, for the freedom it will enjoy when God's children are themselves glorified and thus enabled to be at last what God's image-bearing humans were made to be, wise stewards of creation rather than idolaters who worship creation rather than the Creator. And beauty can then be seen as the glimpse within the world as it is, that the creation itself is designed for something richer and deeper, something in continuity with the present, like the Mozart piano line which points forward to the larger musical whole, but also in discontinuity. And this time it's worse than just a bit of the music, because of course the present world is full of corruption and decay, and that's to be done away with. And art can be seen as the anticipation in the present of at least one part of that wise human stewardship to which we humans are called and which, according to Paul, will be fulfilled at the last. The artist's calling is to hold together heaven and earth, to rehearse the narrative in which past and future, without ceasing to be past and future, become momentarily present, and to enable matter, stone, canvas, paint, wood, catgut, brass, to resonate with life and sound and meaning, through which this can be glimpsed. From this perspective, in other words, and I'm fully aware of the dangers of saying this, we might speak of art in terms of a kind of priesthood. The dangers are real and they matter. The moment we speak of the artist as priest, we open the door not only to fresh insight, but to possible delusion and disaster. The world is not simply a neutral ground where, amid the humdrum, there are occasional glimpses of something a bit more beautiful or exciting, and all it takes is for humans to draw it out. No, all that glisters is not gold. Not all the glimpses of hidden meanings reflect the coming together of heaven and earth and the healing and renewal of creation. The world as we know it is a violent and a brutal place, full of bombs and blood and hatred and horror, of cancers and tsunamis and inexplicable terrors, both created by humans and not created by humans. And since we human beings are part of the problem and not merely part of the solution, the human impulse to give fresh expression to the inarticulate messages that we're picking up from the rest of creation, the impulse of which art in all its forms is one outworking, can itself be flawed and twisted, so that art can deceive as well as telling the truth. Art can seduce as well as suggest. Art can hint at narratives other than the narrative of new creation, the Gnostic alternative, for example. Art can collude with the powers of decay and corruption, as well as planting a signpost which can lead us forward out of the fog. And it's at this point that I return to the question with which I began. How can we say both that the whole earth is full of Yahweh's glory and that the earth shall be full of his knowledge and glory as the waters cover the sea? And how can art, any art, be both utterly realistic about the appalling state of the world and yet a vehicle of hope? The answer of the New Testament, building on that of the Old, is, of course, that in Jesus Christ, the Creator God has addressed and dealt with the problem of evil and death. It should be no surprise that the cross has provided generations of artists with a way of offering a starkly realistic assessment of the way things are, while shot through with the belief which emerges in 1,000 different ways, in statues and paintings and all sorts, that somehow through this apparently disastrous event, new life is to come. No wonder that artists from many traditions, not only the Christian one, have been led in that direction. My favorite one of the novels of the great Jewish novelist Chaim Potok is My Name is Asher Lev, which some of you will know, where Asher Lev, the brilliant young Jewish Hasid with the irrepressible urge to paint, finds himself ultimately painting crucifixions to the utter horror of his parents and co-religionists, because it's the only image he can find anywhere in Western art which does justice to the pain of the Jew in the contemporary world. Very, very striking stuff. But we shouldn't be surprised, though, interestingly, when Neil MacGregor, who's now the director of the British Museum, put on an exhibition for the millennium at the National Gallery in London, where he was then director, he put on an exhibition called Seeing Salvation, which was full of crucifixions. That was what it mostly was. Wonderful Christian art down from very earliest times to the present day. Many of the critics in London sneered at it. Why do we need to see this stuff? This isn't going to help us reimagine a fresh and vibrant world. The public ignored the critics and turned up in droves and went on coming. We went 2 or 3 times. It was a remarkable exhibition. The story of Jesus and his death and resurrection is precisely the narrative of how the pain of the world is yet contained within God's larger redemptive and new creation purposes. The story of how the deep and sharp problems within the old creation are being addressed and dealt with. I've written a lot about that elsewhere. But my point at the moment is that in this story, the depth of horror and injustice and pain and grief is portrayed in all its stark reality. while at the same time it is interpreted within a narrative which speaks of hope and justice and redemption and joy. And the art which flows from those central events does the job of bringing together Isaiah 6 and Isaiah 11. Calvary and Easter draw together the past of the Exodus and the future ultimate consummation. In musical terms, they bring together in rich harmony the song of Miriam by the shores of the Red Sea and the song of the redeemed in the book of Revelation. A victory has been won. Something has happened in the dying and rising of Jesus, something through which the world has become a different place. Oh, we know all the standard objections to that claim. The Enlightenment is full of rhetoric about how the world is not a different place. We know about crusades and inquisitions and all of that, and that the church is part of the problem rather than part of the solution. We know all that so well that we often back off as Christians from making the claim in the first place. But we must make it. The world is a different place through what happened with Jesus. And make it we do every time we celebrate the Eucharist and join in the angelic sanctus near its climax. St. Paul wrote that the gospel had already been preached to every creature under heaven. St. John heard every creature in heaven and on earth and under the earth singing praise to God and the Lamb and saying amen and falling down and worshipping. This isn't just a vision of the ultimate future. This is a vision of the present. The Lamb has triumphed, and all creation knows in its bones that the Creator God is remaking the universe. And the creation is groaning with eager longing as it waits for that to come about. And art is not least what happens when the artist glimpses not just the overlap of heaven and earth, but the healing and restorative coming together of God's world and ours, and the proper and often horrible tension between that future and our own present. And with that, we're already glimpsing a way in which art can avoid the collapse into sentimentality, pretending that the resurrection has entirely happened already when everybody knows it hasn't. The murmured, easy half-truths which comfort for a while but wither in the face of the horror of the world. Equally, art can avoid that brutalism which, under the guise of telling it like it is, denies the very possibility of hope. Art reaches out to fulfill its vocation along the line of listening to the longing and groaning of creation, a longing which is itself multidimensional because it's the evidence of the Spirit's longing and groaning within the world, and expressing and portraying that longing, both in its present agony and in its certain hope. And all this, I suggest, enables us to make sense of those passages from Isaiah. The whole world is already filled with God's glory, which is why, like Isaiah, we feel the shame and the pain and the tragedy of the present in the way that we do. And we find ourselves obliged to pour it out in poems and paintings and drama. There is an unbearable tension between the glory we already know and the horror we still perceive. And also, as Paul puts it, between the sufferings of the present time and the glory which is to be revealed. If this were not so, if the world were merely random and chaotic, there would be no puzzle, no tension, just meaningless darkness. And hence there would be no art, except that which would constitute a mere scream of despair. And even that would make no sense, unless there might, after all, have been some alternative, a notion of hope. But the whole world will ultimately be filled with the knowledge of God, as the waters cover the sea, on the day when creation is set free from its bondage to decay, when God makes all things new and binds up every wound and wipes away every tear. If I'm right even in the general direction in which I am feeling my way in all of this, a biblical vision of beauty and art will recognize that the created order is made for something more than what we can presently see. Something which will both fulfill and transcend its present appearance and purpose. Something which will heal and restore its brokenness, answer its longings and assuage its groanings. To portray the groaning without the hope, or the assuaging without the groaning, is to fail to pay attention to the story, and so to produce art that can at best only offer a half-truth. But to portray the world as it is, so that we glimpse the world as it is to be, and the cost of that transition. That's the trick. to enable the hearer, the onlooker, the participant, to know that the present world is indeed charged with the grandeur of God, and also that there is a new morning yet to come, is to tell the story in its proper balance, reflecting the vision of Isaiah and Paul and John. And of course I'm thinking of every level of art when I say this. In other words, not the mere subject matter of a painting, but the style and the genre, the interplay with tradition, the resonances, the implications at every level of the artist's imagination and choice. So my first and principal proposal this evening, therefore, is that the biblical narrative offers a way of understanding beauty itself and art itself, which can catch up some at least of the other regular ways of making sense of our aesthetic awareness and enhance them. And this sets the stage for my second proposal more briefly, addressing the question then, what use are the arts? Here I find myself in considerable sympathy, mutatis mutandis, with the mid-century critic Theodor Adorno. Adorno argued, to quote a recent summary, that, quote, when concepts fail us, art comes to our aid. Art, especially music, is relatively autonomous of repressive social structures and thus represents a demand for freedom and a critique of society. Art is concentrated social substance. Fascinating quotation. Adorno, of course, was writing with an understandably cynical eye on the events of the mid-century in Germany and elsewhere, and he was bringing to the subject a materialist perspective which is a million miles from the theology of Scripture. But the idea of concepts failing us and of art coming to the rescue remains powerful even when radically transplanted. I suppose if I really believed in what I'm saying, I ought to give the rest of this lecture in the form of playing a sonata, or perhaps like Rolf Harris should grab a paintbrush and sketch it. Alas, you will just have to make do with a verbal signpost to the reality of which I'm speaking, rather than a living example. But what I want to suggest, it should be now obvious, quite obvious, but it needs saying, is that the arts offer not just the decoration around the edge of reality, but vital and central pathways into that freshly imagined world in which it becomes possible once more to believe in the God who raised Jesus from the dead. Art opens the imagination to discover that there are possibilities which a closed, late secular imagination would simply have ruled out. Sometimes when I'm debating with friends or colleagues who find themselves unable to believe in, say, the resurrection of Jesus, they will eventually simply say, but I just can't imagine that. But that ought not to be allowed to remain as a knockdown answer. The problem may well be not in the evidence and the proposal, but in the failure of imagination in the late modern world. Of course, I'm not suggesting that we should then have a carte blanche where anything at all could be imagined with the help of the arts and thereby somehow validated. I mean, Richard Dawkins in his new book is fond of quoting the idea of the celebrated invisible flying teapot, which is circling the world. Didn't you know there was an invisible flying teapot circling the world? Because it's invisible, there's no actual evidence for it, but he says you might just as well believe in it. No, that's not what I'm talking about, just imagining anything at all. Rather, I'm suggesting that the arts play a crucial part in creating a vision of reality, a rejuvenated worldview within which things that are thought impossible are perceived to be not only possible, but actual, and for that matter also beautiful. I begin not with some of the more obvious examples, but with a quite stunning work of art, which now stands in the African section at the British Museum. In Revelation 22, you remember, the river of life flows from the city to irrigate the surrounding countryside. And on its banks there grows the tree of life, not a single tree as in Genesis, but many trees, now freely available, bearing fruit every month and with leaves for healing. This image of the tree of life and of the radical and beautiful healing it promises has generated an extraordinary work of art, one which is part of a sequence of works, but it does stand by itself as well, commissioned jointly by the British Museum and Christian Aid, created by local artists in Mozambique after the end of that country's long and bitter civil war. The work now in the African collection, as I said, at the British Museum, is a sculpture of the tree of life. Stands 9 or 10 feet tall, with spreading branches a further 9 or 10 feet in all directions. And in it and under its shade are birds and animals. And the whole thing, tree, creatures and all, is made entirely from decommissioned weapons. Bits and pieces of old AK-47s, bullets, machetes, and all the horrible paraphernalia of war. And the point, of course, and it is a stunningly beautiful object at many levels, the point is that this tree of life reflects the Isaianic promise that swords will be beaten into plowshares and spears into pruning hooks. And the tree stands as a reminder both of the horror of the world, with all its multiple human follies and tragedies, not least, I have to say, as most of the weapons were made in the comfortable Western world and sold, and we gave them aid so that they could buy the weapons we had made so that they could kill each other with them. That's a whole other story. Come back to that tomorrow night. The Tree of Life and other works that have come out like it has an immediate and powerful message for the people of Mozambique. You see the point, the imagination. They had forgotten how to hope through the years of the Civil War. They'd forgotten that there might be such a thing as peace, as sitting once more under the tree and enjoying its fruit and its healing. And therefore that tree is also a sign of what genuine art can be, taking a symbol from the world of the original creation, building into it the full recognition of the horrors of the present world, which by themselves would lead us to despair, and celebrating the promise of the new world, a world full of God's glory and healing and hope as the waters cover the sea. It offers, in other words, celebration without sentimentality, sorrow without cynicism, and hope without wishful thinking. Standing before it is like glimpsing an apocalyptic vision, a vision of the beauty of God. I hope it's clear from this example that I'm not primarily speaking of the use of art simply, shall we say, to portray the biblical stories, though that's important as well in a culture that partly knows them and mostly doesn't, and which needs to be reminded of their power and their haunting and puzzling challenge. I'm thinking more of the way in which, whether in books like the Harry Potter series or in works like those of J.R.R. Tolkien, you enter a narrative world which, though at one level it's fantastic and cheerfully unbelievable, quickly persuades us that at another level it is more believable than the assumptions by which late secular modernity has ordered its little world. And at this point we really are in a battleground, as some of you will know, with people like Philip Pullman writing, as it were, deliberately on the other side, creating a fantastic and brilliant and utterly anti-Christian children's fantasy world. There's an awful lot of stuff going on there. But I'm also thinking of ways in which a poet like Michael O'Shiel, who I hope some of you know, enters more deeply into the mystery of human life, whether in his recent deeply countercultural book, Celebrating Lifelong Marriage, or his earlier and deeply poignant book on the Holocaust. So that though the text of his poetry does not introduce us to explicit biblical material or to the classic themes of Christian theology, we emerge from those poems ready to reread Scripture and ready to re-pray Scripture, with belief and obedience seeming the norm rather than the exception. See what I mean? That's what Christian art can be like. A counterexample, saying this will no doubt risk the wrath of some, might be to point out that even when Caravaggio is portraying explicitly Christian themes, perhaps especially when he's doing that, his own tortured soul and violent life keep intruding, so that we are left not so much gasping, so it might after all be true, but recognizing rather the fatal twist that runs through all human life, always teetering on the cynical deconstruction of the great meaning that he was actually portraying. And that, no doubt, is also worth drawing attention to. But I suspect that now, frankly, with the postmodern world preaching night and day that all our righteousness is as filthy rags, we don't need to be dragged down into that yet again. We need to be lured, wooed, imagined back into faith and hope and love. And this call, like the analysis I offered above, is rooted in the very nature of the created order, the Eucharistic possibility, the stuff of earth being charged with the life of heaven, is near the center of genuine Christian art. As such, picking up the human vocation to be pro-creators with God the lavish creator, it ought to be the artists and musicians, the poets and the dancers who lead the way into a fresh expression of Christian faith that could shape the cultural life of a new generation. Take the field of music. We relish the resonances of generations long gone as we sing again the great church music of yesterday. But we must respond to the vocation to use our historic resources as the launching pad for new forms, new ways of saying old things, which will have not only an impact in themselves, but the possibility of creating a climate for Christian mission in the postmodern world. See, one of the reasons people find the Christian faith unbelievable is that when the surrounding culture is giving off the message that the only alternatives are trivial tunes on the one hand and industrial cacophony on the other. One of the reasons people might find the Christian faith not only credible but attractive is if the artists led the way in generating a world, a universe of discourse, within which it would make glorious sense to say, I believe in God the Father Almighty and in Jesus, his Son, risen from the dead. One of my closest friends, who's actually Dean of the Cathedral in Durham, and so a close colleague, was brought up as basically an atheist Jew in North London. His parents were non-practicing Jews, and they sent him quite deliberately to a school which didn't have any religious tradition, so that he could be just kept away from all that stuff. And the school, nevertheless, had a music society, and he was keen on music, so he joined up. And blow me, one year they sang the St. John Passion. And at the age of 14, he was converted by singing Bach. He's today a wonderful theologian and preacher. What we need to recapture in our day is the prospect of new creation, whether in global politics, as we'll get to in tomorrow's lecture, in economics, in theology, and biblical studies even. Yes, it might even reach there, and in everything else as well. And the new creation of fresh works of art has the possibility, the priestly possibility of which I spoke earlier, of pointing towards that renewal of all things which we are promised. Sing to the Lord a new song. There's a lovely poem by the English poet Wendy Cope, just a brief poem talking about how when she was a kid and she got confirmed, her granny gave her a prayer book, and the prayer book went on the shelf and was really ignored. And then one day, many, many years later, she went to a service of choral evensong in Winchester Cathedral, and she saw that her granny had written, "Sing to the Lord a new song." And she, as a poet, said, "Granny, it's just what I wanted." Suddenly, a whole new vista emerged. Because as the psalmist insisted, when you sing to the Lord a new song, then you can watch for the whole creation, the sea and the hills and the fields and the animals and all that is in them, joining in as they are longing to do. Stay with music just for a moment longer. In the final scene of Revelation, there is no more sea, interestingly. The dark power which God defeated in creation at the Exodus, in the victory of the Son of Man, that dark force is finally overthrown. Likewise, there is no sun or moon, because they are, after all, signs and symbols for the life and light and power of God the Creator. Nor is there a temple, because God himself is there and the Lamb. But the whole book of Revelation resonates with the music which goes before us into the New Jerusalem. Or rather, I think we should say, which comes from God's ultimate future into our present. Think about it. Within the brilliance of Gothic architecture, it is music that enables you to inhabit not only the spaces down here, but the spaces up there, which in that architecture are designed to symbolize the world of the angels and archangels. It's music that rolls round the rafters and draws us mysteriously into that. And even so, it is music, I suggest, which comes forward into our present world from God's future. Music is, in that sense, a form of glossolalia. To the critic who says that music is incomprehensible and nonsensical, we reply, well, of course. Did you expect the language of heaven to be translated without loss into the language of earth? Did you expect that the ultimate shout of victory would make complete sense in a world that still has so much violence and hatred and suspicion? No, the calling of the composer and performer, as well as being simply to create and exult in beauty, is to sing the song now, which speaks by its very form of the ultimate triumph, and which speaks it, therefore, not just in words that happen to be set, that in a sense is just the icing on the cake, but in the very structure and substance of the music itself. Just as in 1 Corinthians 13, there are some things which pass away, but others which will last, of which love is the chief. So music, no doubt purified and ennobled in ways we can't begin to imagine. Music is a link not only with the present heavenly world, but I suggest with the future world, when heaven and earth are one, when the song of Miriam will become the song of every creature under heaven, when we shall all at last obey the psalmist's injunction to sing a new song to the Lord and have the whole creation join in. Music, I think, even more than poetry and painting, catches up the performers in what, from the point of view of secular modernity, is a perplexing ennoblement, but which, from the point of view of a biblical faith, can appear not only as a fulfillment of a human vocation, but also as an invitation to the wider world to join in. Now, this is only the beginning of what might be said. I'm well aware of that. But I hope I've done enough to open before you, perhaps especially before any artists and musicians among you, the possibility that we in our generation might not only be able to understand better what beauty and art might be, but also to see more clearly how a wise use of them could help us not merely to illustrate, but to embody and expound at a structural level far deeper than that of mere decoration, the truth of the biblical message, not merely as a set of true ideas, but as a way of life, a way which is once more possible after the denials of late modernity and the necessary but ultimately sterile deconstructions of postmodernity. It's high time to conclude, and I do so with a final reflection on the way in which the Bible itself embodies the imaginative principle which, as I have argued, it ought to stimulate. Instead of the sentimentality which claps its hands childishly at the beauty of the world but turns its face away from any glimpse of ugliness, and instead of the brutalism that celebrates ugliness in order to demonstrate that it hasn't been taken in by sentimentalist claptrap, we find in the biblical traditions a remarkable movement, a to and fro of celebration and grief, held in tension by each other, but without compromising their essential character or losing their full force. I happened this morning in the course of my daily readings to be reading Psalm 89, forgetting I was going to be referring to it this evening. Psalm 89 does exactly that wonderful celebration of the promises of God to David, just set side by side in awesome and shocking poetic parallelism with the statement, but now it's all over. You've cast us off. The covenant has been abandoned. It's not working. And the poet constructs a poem which states the glory and the shame of the way things are. For instance, again, the book of Proverbs, with its prudential and practical wisdom and constant promises of blessing for those who seek and find it, is balanced canonically by the word of Job, which sweeps away any lingering sentimental reading of, say, Deuteronomy. Not a statement of nihilism, but of a loyal, if battered faith. Though he slay me, yet will I trust him. And the two come together, of course, in Ecclesiastes, which is grumpily realistic rather than brutalist, and in the Song of Songs, which is spectacularly celebratory without being in the least sentimental. And when we turn to the great, large narratives of the Hebrew Scriptures, we find that rhythm of affirmation and confrontation, of the goodness of the world and the problem of evil, woven together on every page. Think of Scripture as a work of art. Think of the bits of Scripture as works of art, and reflect and learn again what that might mean. All this, of course, comes rushing together in the Gospels, which tower over the rest of the canon for all sorts of reasons, but not least for their astonishing artistry. I sometimes have said to students, if you can imagine that the Gospels had been lost entirely, and then suddenly some bright archaeological spark dug them up in the sands of Egypt, the whole world would say, these are the most extraordinary pieces of writing. It's not just a few stories about this odd man called Jesus. They are remarkable works of art in their own right. Look at them like that, not to the detriment of their theological and historical meaning, of course not, but to enjoy them for the full. The Gospels are not, of course, immune from the belittling tendencies of our culture. There is, alas, many a nativity play which collapses the political drama of the birth of the Messiah into sheer sentimentality. And there is many a passion play, whether by Kazantzakis or Scorsese or whoever else, which collapses into mere brutalism. Mel Gibson's, of course, managed to do both at the same time, which was a remarkable achievement, but less than helpful in doing what I've been talking about in this lecture, which is finding the way through at a structural level to a reappropriation of the gospel message of heaven and earth overlapping, of past and future coming together in the present, and of the trans-signification of the material world, so that for a moment at least it flames out with the glory of God. That is, of course, the subtext of all that I've been saying. And let me draw it together by quoting properly at last the end of that poem by Gerard Manley Hopkins, to which I've alluded a few times already, which brings together, as only somebody like Hopkins could do in a single sonnet, the vision of Isaiah 6 and the messianic promise of Isaiah 11 and the promise of Romans 8, embodying in this poem as well as expressing the vision that I've tried to set before you. And for all this, nature is never spent. There lives the dearest freshness, deep down things. And though the last lights of the black west went, oh, morning at the brown brink eastward springs, because the Holy Ghost over the bent world broods, with warm breast and with, bright wings. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Wright. That was stimulating and outstanding. We have time now for a few minutes of questions.
Do we have a roving mic or a... yeah. Oh, okay.
Okay, we have a microphone, so raise your hand, and then you can ask your question into the mic.
I was just all right. I was just curious. The gentleman that you had mentioned, sir, at the college in Durham that was converted through the his name's escaping me.
I didn't mention it. His name is Michael Sadgrove.
Oh, that would be why it's escaping me. Do you think? I'm just curious as to sort of the scope that you attribute revelation to works of art, and especially to works like the Bible specifically. Do you think that he, aside from what you know of him, personally, do you think that he could have been converted by something like the straight scripture, or do you think it took something like the Bach piece?
That's one of those wonderful what-if questions, isn't it? Could it have been this way? Bottom line, God can do whatever God wants to do. I mean, that's sort of basic. But I think one of the many reasons that God has given to people the gifts of music and art and drama and all the rest of it is not only so that they can simply celebrate the richness of being human and of living in this extraordinary world and of drawing people's attention to its multidimensionality and its narratives, etc., but of thereby precisely making a bridgehead into the worldview which had previously been closed to any mention. If somebody had said to him, here's the New Testament, it's a Christian book, you should read it, he'd have probably glanced at it and said, oh, no, that's that religion stuff, my parents warned me off, you know. It wouldn't have got through. The music can succeed. This is the point of the Adorno quote, that where concepts fail, art can help us move forward. And, God could have done it in a number of different ways, but I relish the fact that he did it like this.
Thank you very much. Another right over here. Tim?
Dr. Wright, first of all, I think that not only Gerard Manley Hopkins, but William Blake would have approved, if William Blake had lived to 250 years old, he would have stood up and cheered your lecture, which I certainly mean to be very high praise indeed. However, as a literary scholar rather than a New Testament or biblical scholar, I'm slightly troubled by the way, and several times in the lecture, you use the word deconstruction, at one point linking it with the word cynical. And I'm sure you would accept that there is a certain cynical misuse of deconstruction, which I've seen associated with French thinkers like Baudrillard. There is also a very serious use of deconstruction, which philosophers like Christopher Norris and David Baker have clarified, pointing out that Jacques Derrida was not a nihilist by any means, but a profoundly ethical thinker. And the name of Emmanuel Levinas also perhaps comes up in this connection. In his later years, Derrida expressed, as I'm sure you know, great indebtedness to the thinking of Levinas. And, I mean, in a nutshell, but their thinking in both cases comes out of a Jewish response to the Shoah, to the Holocaust. I invite you to comment on what may be happening, in a sense, in parallel in Jewish theological thinking and in Jewish ethical thinking contemporaneously with what we call postmodernism, and the possibility of a Christian-Jewish dialogue on something like this. In other words, to distance yourself a little bit from the implication that deconstruction is simply all about cynicism, nihilism, and tearing down. Right.
Absolutely. You're spot on, and I haven't read all the people that you mentioned, but I understand where the thing is going. It's funny because I find sometimes when I'm lecturing about the gospel and postmodernity, I get accused of being such an arrant postmodernist that I'm saying that the entire Enlightenment was rubbish, and I was trying to distance myself from that in a way, and it's hard to get the balance just right, and certainly in my own field, some of the deconstruction that has gone on has been extremely cynical, and people have used tools borrowed from Derrida, etc., just to play silly games, to be honest, with texts and traditions and so on, in a very unhelpful way. But equally, I have said many times, both in lectures and in print, that I do regard the movement to deconstruction as a necessary, if you like, preaching of the doctrine of the fall to the arrogant, self-deceiving world of high modernity. And I think that's precisely what's going on, not just post-Holocaust, but actually, post-First World War, etc. You see all this coming up ever since Nietzsche, at least, that where the world had got to was a place where somebody needed to go back to the roots, and Derrida has a passion for justice, and part of the difficulty is Alistair McIntyre's phrase, whose justice, and how do you know, and what is this justice thing? But that is a revelation, I think, like Levinas, of the deep Jewish sort of instinct underneath it all, and of the determination, rather like Paul said, we pull down all those proud structures that arrogate to themselves other ways of doing things in order to get back to what really matters. So that is a task that I honor and acknowledge. And as I say, it is difficult to fine-tune it when one is rather skating over the thin ice as one is going on to make another point. But I'm really grateful, and I shall look back at my text and see if I can nuance it a bit more at the appropriate points. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Another question. Yes, sir.
Hope I can get my thoughts straight. I understand your basic thesis to mean that we have withdrawn so far from beauty and art as an expression of our love for God and His for us, that we are actually cheating ourselves of a fuller worship experience. I also sense the danger of going too far the other way. We get so caught up in what we consider to be beauty and art that we sometimes can not see a danger behind it. I think of the scripture verse where Satan can present himself as an angel of light, and I dare say that such creatures are beautiful to look upon. Would it be a fair assessment then to say that the tension that you spoke of between the ugliness and the beautiful, we need that tension in order to be able to have the right amount of discernment to determine true beauty versus the counterfeits that are out there?
At the moment, yes. It seems to me it's hard to say what is genuine art because people can come up with all sorts of examples and counterexamples and you can bat it to and fro. But I think the art that people recognize as such and stand in awe in front of or in the presence of or whatever is art that is both revealing the multidimensionality of human life and is saying something about that narrative in which there is both great ugliness and great hope, in which there is both the tragedy and the possibility of resolution, or at least of the making sense of something which otherwise might collapse into chaos. And that imperative towards making sense is hugely important, but of course it goes with the equal and opposite imperative not to make sense too quickly, not to short-circuit the argument, not to say, oh, well, that's all right then. You know, like cheap and tacky solutions to the problem of evil, which leave us saying, oh, well, that's okay, there isn't really a problem there, is there? Whereas, you know, anyone who lives in the real world knows that actually there is a problem, and you can't just wave it away. So yes, art is what happens when artists are grappling with those things and refusing to be fobbed off by cheap and tacky things. And I think I did say, and I want to stress, that art can deceive as well as illuminate, and that sometimes very great art can lead people down wrong tracks. I hesitate to suggest too many obvious examples, but I have sometimes myself found that though I love some bits of Stravinsky, I cannot listen to The Rite of Spring. I just can't. I just find it saying things to me, and I think I should not be listening to this. Now, other people may be quite happy with it. This may be unique to me, I don't know. And I felt that about it when I was quite young, before I had any developed potential theological critique. In other words, I wasn't coming expecting to think this is a wicked bit of paganism or black magic or something. I just didn't know. I just found myself profoundly uncomfortable in the presence of that music. And one of the very few times that I've actually just sort of taken a record and taken the needle off it. I don't want to go there. So, and I may be quite wrong, and there may be things in that music I'm missing, but I just give that as an example of where I can say, this is a great composer, but I think he was going in entirely a dangerous direction there, and that is not about God's new creation. It is not getting the balance right, etc.
Very good. Another question.
Oh, sorry.
Yes, Doctor, I just wrote down something here. You say that music is a form of glossolalia?
Glossolalia, speaking in tongues.
Oh, that's what that means.
Sorry, glossolalia, speaking. Sorry, that's just technical term for speaking in tongues. It's a way of saying, isn't it odd? We make these funny sounds, which both. There you are. Wonderful. We make these funny sounds which have no instant apparent meaning, and yet which have a very deep and profound meaning. And if someone were to, if a Martian were to come into a room where people were making music and say, what on earth are you making all these funny sounds for? It's actually quite hard to describe why we do this stuff and why we pay so much attention to it. And of course there are some people who are tone deaf, just like there are some people who are colorblind, for whom music is quite literally not only meaningless but annoying. And yet for most of us, music just takes us somewhere else and does different things to us and with us, and we realize that we're part of a larger whole, and we just wouldn't be without it. So that's why I say it's like speaking in tongues, in the sense that it's a gift which appears to transcend rationality. No doubt the Richard Dawkinses of this world can produce Darwinian explanations of why humans do this funny stuff, but having read some of Dawkins's explanations of some other phenomenon, I'm not likely to be convinced by a dragging down of music to that level. Thank you. Somebody at the back there, yes.
Many of those of us who do preach like to see our preaching as art as well. Could you say something about how you think that preaching could be part of the replenishing of imagination?
Thank you, yes. I'm sure it can, and I'm sure it should, and I'm sure that places an enormous burden on the preacher, both the preacher who isn't actually very good at rhetoric and has to work desperately hard and then feels guilty if he or she hasn't actually produced an aesthetically pleasing sermon, because a sermon is not primarily designed to be an aesthetic work of art. A sermon is a moment when heaven and earth overlap in the presence of the Word of God. And it seems to me that just as J.S. Bach does that brilliantly through the Passions, etc., so a preacher without any aesthetic sensibility or rhetorical skill can nevertheless, through prayer and humility and sitting in the presence of God with Scripture open, and then the determination through the love of his or her people to communicate to them what is being glimpsed in this text, that can happen without any artistic embellishment. So there's both the burden, if we say, yes, it should be a work of art, and the guilt if people can't do it, and maybe they shouldn't, but also the danger of pride, that if you actually discover that you do know how a discourse can be constructed so that it's rhetorically pleasing, and then you manage to produce such a discourse in the pulpit, then, I don't like it when I come down from the pulpit thinking, "Oh, that was good, wasn't it?" I mean, I don't often do that, but just no. I mean, it's quite a serious point. It's quite a serious point, because preaching, I think, real preaching ought to leave you pretty drained. Actually, it's a tough thing to do. Preaching is totally different from lecturing or other forms of teaching, in my experience. So yes, I mean, if you find that words are your thing and that writing is your thing and that you understand how paragraphs work, then work at it. But as with much art, the real art is in the concealing of the art. Like when you're watching the great violinist who just seems to be dashing it off, doesn't look as if it's any effort. The art is the hard work that goes on, so that the last thing you want is your congregation thinking, "Oh, what a wonderfully rhetorically crafted sermon." If they're thinking that, it's a bad sermon. You hear what I'm saying? Yeah. There's another question, I think, at the back there. Yes.
I was recently in a discussion with some friends, and I'm familiar with something similar, an argument that I was introduced in my undergrad, where a professor spent an entire course discussing faith, reason, and imagination as separate and necessary faculties of knowing. And it was wonderful just reading all kinds of different texts that sort of pick up on the three. But as I was trying to describe it myself, I realized that it might be hard not to start just for the whole threefold distinction just to collapse into just reason and faith. And I guess the way to illustrate that is your example where you talked about music and that there must be something to it that defies a purely rational account, or like, for example, a Darwinian account of why we do that. But do we know that some other way than just believing it? And so is it not just, again, faith? Or is there truly a place that is just imagination that's not reason or faith? It's something else.
It's very difficult, isn't it? This is a whole other lecture, I suppose. One would need to define what one meant by imagination, define what one meant by reason, define what one meant by faith. And only when you've done that could you cautiously see where they locked into each other and where, to use a mechanistic analogy, where the cogs actually meshed and how that worked. Sorry, the mechanistic analogy drags down a nicer question into something more trivial. But I suppose I'm reacting against the placing of the imagination at a discount. I mean, the world I've described is curiously paradoxical here, where on the one hand you have people, and I was thinking of my good friend Marcus Borg, saying, I just can't imagine that, as though that's the end of the game. I can't imagine it, therefore I can't believe it. And me saying to him, try doing something with your imagination, try working on that, enlarging your imagination. But then so imagination there being the thing which determines, but other people saying, oh, it's all imagination, meaning it's all trivial, irrelevant, subjective, etc. And so what I'm trying to hold out for is a robust and nuanced view of imagination, which resonates with both the way the world actually is and the way in which, in the promises of God, it is to be, and which can, through the use of artistic imagination, display the narrative, which then is the narrative of faith and is a narrative about which we can and do reason. And in other words, I suppose I'm doing what I said would take a whole lecture to do. If you have a big enough view of imagination, it will join up with the others. Easier perhaps to do this with some worked examples, but not tonight. I mean, to think about music or poetry or dance or whatever, and see how that works.
Thank you very much. All right, this will have to be the last question. Go right ahead.
Yeah, it's you, sir. Yeah.
It's not so much a question, just a quick comment. You mentioned Jacques Maritain in your talk, whose wife was a poet. And I think he would totally agree with the point you were just making about and the gentleman's question about imagination as being not reducible into reason and faith, which is why he even attempted to add to Thomas's 5 ways a sixth argument from the aesthetic sense.
Yeah.
So there's a tradition there in Christian thought that there is an ineluctable third element that's a part of our response.
Yes, it's very, very interesting, and this is part of what that book by Rowan Williams, Grace and Necessity, is all about. I don't know if you know it. It's like a lot that Rowan writes. It's short but dense. You have to take it rather slowly. But I'm not myself happy about bringing art in as a proof of the existence of God, because I don't think you can actually do that. I mean, but what I do in the first 4 chapters of my book, Simply Christian, is to talk about justice, spirituality, relationships, and then beauty, not as proofs, the moral argument for the existence of God or whatever, but as what I call echoes of a voice that I think almost all human beings through history and across cultures are aware of an imperative to justice, of the possibility of spirituality, of multidimensionality within human existence, of both the imperative and the puzzle of relationships. We all know we're made for each other, but we all know we're bad at it. And then particularly of this odd thing about beauty, that we are drawn towards beauty and yet it remains frustratingly incomplete. And the sunset fades and it's dark and so on and so on. So I use those 4 as ways of saying not we've got these 4, therefore there is a God, but here are questions which classic human experience leaves us with. Now, let's try listening to some stories, and because I'm a Christian, try listening to this story, and as we hear that story, the Jesus story, we discover within the Jewish tradition as it reaches its climax in Jesus, we discover a God and a human being for whom justice was absolutely basic, for whom spirituality was where it was at, in whom relationships were healed and restored, and who spoke and acted of a world completed so that we've actually got the rest of the string quartet and not just the piano part. So that's the way I would do it, not by trying to add another thing onto Aquinas, but by stepping back a little from the ambition of Aquinas, but nevertheless embracing what I think Maritain was really trying to get at.
Let's show our appreciation for Dr. Wright.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Great. Thank you very much.